All right, so for this example, let's say we want to create a simple RPG, a role-playing game in Java. So essentially a video game for those of you who are not familiar. So this program should help players manage their game characters. So we'll store basic info about each character, their name, their health, their current like level, right, of experience in the game. Track which weapon the character uses, calculate how much damage a character does during battle, and then of course produce reports on each character's stats and performance, right? So we can display them perhaps on the screen. So here's some classes we might create to meet those goals. And again, remember the reason we're introducing classes, right, at the same time as methods is because we're actually going to clarify, right, static versus instance. I know I've kind of been stringing you along, but finally, right, this will make a little bit more sense. All right, so here's a UML diagram for the role-playing game example. UML diagrams are real diagrams that programmers use to visualize a program's class design. So we have our main program here that just runs the program, right? That's where we'd have our main method. But instead of throwing all our code in the main, we'd actually separate it into different files. We'd have weapon.java, character.java, battlehelper.java. And each class is encapsulated, right, to a specific object, a specific feature of the program. So again, rather than throwing everything in main, making it messy, we kind of reduce, right, the cognitive load, right, on other programmers and say, hey, I'm not going to make you read my whole code in one file. I'm going to split it up into other files. So it's not only easier for you to understand, but it's way more organized, right? It's going to be a lot easier to go through as well. So we have our weapon class, right? So the name of the weapon, the damage it inflicts, and then some methods, right? If we actually want to get the name of the method, we use, uh, get the name of the object, the weapon object, right? Maybe it's a sword. We use a method to get the name as well as we use a method to get the damage. These are called getters. We'll explore that much more in detail, right, in the next lesson. Then we have our character class here. Here are the attributes. So yeah, all the minus properties indicate attributes, and then the plus ones indicate methods. So character, we got to know the name of the character, their health, that's an integer, their level that they're at, that's also an integer, and then they can also hold on to a weapon, right? Which is a custom class. So you can actually make a reference to this class inside the character class. We'll cover that way more in the next lesson. But yeah, here we split it up into different classes, and then we have Battle Helper class. So this has no attributes. All it does is help us calculate things, right? So rather than calculate it directly in each of these classes, we can use the Battle Helper to do that. So each class is responsible for handling a separate feature of the game. So the character object stores data related to a player's in-game character. Each weapon object holds data about a weapon and how much damage it deals. The battle helper is a helper class used to calculate battle results like damage, critical hits. Right, a critical hit means you've defeated the enemy. It's that critically important hit. So a helper class, what is a helper class? Well, it's a class designed to perform specific tasks, usually to support the main classes in your program. So it's helping out other classes. So rather than doing all the calculations here, we throw it into Battle Helper. So it does not store data, it just performs calculations or checks, often using static methods. So we're already, easing into instance versus static. When do you use one over the other? All right, so the character and weapon classes use instance methods because they work with data stored on the individual objects, so character's name or health. Because we need to hold on to this information, we need to remember the information for character and weapons because we're using these over and over again, right? And we want to keep track of that information. That's an instance method. It relies on the information stored in the object. The object's going to hold on to that information, remember it for us so that we can use it at a later time. We need to keep track of it, like their level, right? Their health. Battle Helper, on the other hand, is going to use static methods because it only performs calculations and doesn't actually store any data. It doesn't need to remember anything to be a calculator, right? If your calculator didn't have a memory feature, you'd probably be fine, right? It is convenient, but you don't really need it, right, on those simple calculators. So the key difference between instance and static. Instance relies on data inside the object. It needs to keep track of it at a future time. Static methods do not. They just work immediately with the inputs that you give them. They're meant for one-time use. They don't rely on using or storing data in an object. Think of the math class. The math class is a bunch of static methods because the math class is designed for one-time calculations. If I need to calculate, the exponent of something, I don't need to remember that, right? For my next calculation. Sure, I can store it in a variable, like we can remember it that way, but we don't need to actually store it in an object. An object is really only when you want to store a group of information, a group of variables, a group of data together. If it's just one-time use, right, a variable gets the job done. So that's where static methods are useful for those one-time uses. Now, if you need to, keep all that information together and you need to transform it over time, keep track of it, like a character will, right? You need to keep track of their level, their health over time. The weapon class, right? You're going to use that weapon with that character over and over again. You need to keep track of that information, especially of the different weapons, right? If you need to keep track of this group of information, you got to use instance methods. So that's the key difference. So yeah, static versus instance methods, right? Weapon and character, those would be classic instance methods. Battle helper would be a static method. So with instance methods, there were stricter rules surrounding the method name only syntax. Where can you use it in these classes? So we're going to take a look at an example. So here in this example, we have our character class, and then we have two methods, right? A new one called display intro, just for this example, and we have get name, back from our actual class design, right? So get name and display intro are instance methods. How do I know? Because they don't have a static on them. So by default, instance methods. That means they rely on character objects. So usually if I'm going to call the get name somewhere else in my code, I actually need to do the object name dot get name. But there is a method name only syntax where I don't have to do the object name dot. I could just use the method name. And notice it's right there. I'm calling the get name with inside display intro. And turns out that's the rule. I can use the method name only syntax when I'm calling one instance method inside another, and they belong in the same class. So this is the only time you can get away with the shorthand, with the shorter method name syntax. So I don't need object.getName. I just have getName here. Why does that work? Well, Java can tell, hey, we're working off the same character. So I can assume that when you call getName from display intro, you're referring to the same character we're working with. All this other stuff, right, the constructor, we're going to go over that in the next lesson, not this lesson, so don't worry about it. I just wanted to explain the syntax, right, of instance methods. You can use the shorthand as long as you're using an instance method inside another instance method. Another asterisk, they got to be in the same class, of course, right? We're always talking about the same class here when we're doing the shorthand. If you go way back to these slides, way back, from inside the class for both static and instance type, you can use method name only if you're inside the class. But remember, instance type, I put those asterisks, and the asterisk, we're finally clarifying it here. You can use the shorthand only if it's inside another instance method. Static is a little bit more flexible. So let's go over the rules one more time. So instance methods, you can use a method name shorthand when calling an instance method from inside another instance method from inside the same class. Very confusing, but it is important we go over the syntax now. We'll take a deeper dive, right? You'll get more used to it. Over the next lessons, we'll definitely get our hands wet, though, in some of the assignments this week. There are stricter rules, right, for the shorthand syntax for instance methods. For static methods, you can use the method name shorthand in any method in the class, anywhere you want, right? As long as you're still inside the same class. So it could be static and non-static methods. It doesn't really matter. So for static methods, it's a lot more flexible. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's why we did a little intro on Java classes, because it's important, right, to describe the difference between instance and static when we're referring to methods. We did need that class context to explain that. And that's just going to make our life easier for next lesson. We're going to have so much information that we've already looked at. We're just going to be taking, a closer look at those concepts. So next up is, of course, going to be demos. We'll go over the assignments for this lesson.